Welcome to Talking at No One, the show where I, Aloney, hang out by myself, because I need to write this right now. For the last month or so, I've been incredibly obsessed with SCP, listening to countless podcasts and watching short films and reading a lot of the different articles. And I made a couple of videos about it, but I'm starting to get really addicted to talking about this. So I've decided I'm going to just get it all out, and I'm going to try to figure out how you could adapt SCP. And more than that, I want to talk about the different kinds of adaptations there are, and I want to talk about what I would do and what I wish someone else would do so I don't have to do it. If you don't know, SCP stands for Secure, Contain, and Protect. It's a series of articles online that are in like a Wikipedia type format. It's like a big wiki called SCP. And it's about a group of scientists, security people, and detained prisoners who track down, understand, secure, contain, and protect various anomalous characters and creatures. These objects, creatures, and people that have unique abilities and powers that go outside of the reality and do things that shouldn't make any sense. They do all kinds of things, and the SCP stories are based around the idea of reports. You take an insane thing and describe it as coldly and methodically as possible. Just the facts, as if someone in a corporate office wrote it. Just a simple, by-the-book report. They come off really good. They have a very interesting flow in how they work, and all of the stories have very similar cadence because they're trying to match a specific tone. All the stories are completely different. There's millions of genres. It covers all kinds of stories and has created like this almost seemingly infinite level of stories where they are at 6,000 SCPs right now, and there's more that are up for review because anyone can go on SCP and try to write a story and be judged by the rest of the viewers. All the readers can come in, read their stories in a big forum, and the ones that are upvoted enough get to continue existing. And after 24 hours, if you are downvoted too much, you will be deleted. Every once in a while, they'll do a series where they publish a bunch of those stories in 1,000 stories at a time. Every SCP has a number. SCP-001s are special SCPs that are about the lore of the entire universe, and there can be multiple of them, and the lore basically treats it as if they could be true, they could not be true. They could all be fake, some of them could be true, and it's up to you to decide the canon of SCP. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen on the internet. It was created only because of the internet, and it's a fantastic product. And with the fact that all media nowadays has to be connected to an individual IP, SCP is one of the only royalty-free stories we can actually play with and make stories about without any consequences. It's a playground that everyone loves, it has a built-in audience, and they're very compelling and good. Some of them can be ridiculous, but none of them are bad. You can disagree with some and not introduce them into the lore, but you'll still probably like them. There may be some you don't like just by taste, but you can usually agree that they're pretty good. A lot of people have tried to adapt SCP, and I want to adapt it, but I can never make anything. That's why I have this show, so that I could write the stuff I want to make. But SCP is fantastic because it's the only real story universe that hasn't been bought up by some corporate asshole. It's free for anyone to use, and it's free for anyone to believe it in different ways. And anyone can join in. It's the most inclusive storytelling process of our generation. And it's based upon Lovecraft and the idea of the Cthulhuan mythos, the idea of like old ones and ancient gods that a really bad dude, a terrible dude, made with some really crazy ideas because he was kind of insane. But afterward, people read his stories and were like, all right, let's take them and get the good stuff and make different stories. And now it's sort of free to use, but there is a lot of copyrighted versions of it. But SCP is basically, what if anyone could tell those stories? And it was open to the public, and we could tell anything we wanted. And it's expanded and grown, and it's one of the most beautiful things on the internet. It's been adapted a couple of times, too. So I've been making these SCP videos, and I've been trying to find B-roll, background footage to use for the edit. And they're so good. There's a bunch of movies about this. And even an animated series someone made. There's podcasts, a ton of them. And people are very interested and fascinated in this world, and it's very easy to get pulled in as a creator. And I've actually tried to write a couple of SCPs, but I haven't had the guts to post them yet. But I may one day. And I'm just fascinated by this beautiful universe. And I want other people to know about it. People who would never read the internet. People who would never listen to podcasts. I want everyone to understand and explore this beautiful universe. So how would you do that? How would you adapt SCP? Well, at this point, most people have just done short films because it's the easiest way for a small creator to make art. When it comes to film, it's very difficult, and you need a very large budget, and you need a lot of people behind you. And it's almost as difficult as being a captain on a pirate ship. It's so improbable, and you need so many people to back you for it to even start. But you're almost drawn to do it. And a lot of filmmakers have made some really good short films. Some people have made really amateur short films, but there's a few really big festival-level short films about this. And if you want to see them, I'll probably put a list in the description. If not, on my YouTube channel, Aloney or Baloney or one of those. I have a couple. I have a lot of videos where I show those off, and then at the end of the video have sort of a link to the actual short film. And I love them. They're great. And I'm happy about this, but I want more than just that. And there is an animated series, but there's still more room to play with. And when I've been thinking about SCP, personally, I think it should be like a Twilight Zone show. I mean, the Twilight Zone is just a bunch of short stories thrown together that are weird with a voiceover over it. There's Black Mirror, which did sort of the same thing, but without the voiceover. There's Dimension 404, which I think is a really good show that no one has fucking seen. They've done very similar things. But SCP is like this gold mine of entertainment, and no one is using it other than a couple of really good fans who make these epic short films. But imagine if you had the budget and you had real people caring about this shit and they actually were making it, like, continuously. I wish I could do that, but as of right now I can't, so I'm just gonna try to figure out how that would work. So how would you adapt SCP as like a TV show? There's a couple of different ways you could do it. I've been thinking about this for a while, and it's good to just say it out loud. You could do a Twilight Zone type show where every week it's a different SCP, and it just starts with a file, and then you cut into it. And the good little bits of the show would be the reoccurring characters that appear in the various SCP stories. The O5 Council, there's a couple of like low-level people sometimes. There's some SCPs that pop up over and over again, and you could really use those as sort of a character-based thing to show up in the randomized episodes. So you just pick really good SCPs and you would just tell those stories. You would use a little bit of combination of some tales that people wrote on the internet, which is like, I wouldn't say fan fiction, but it's like semi-canon short stories about SCPs, and then they get included in when they're really good. You could use the actual reports to start off episodes. There's sometimes exploration logs in reports that are way more complicated and cinematic. You could even write stories outside of the stories. You could write your own tales and make those the show. And it would take me 1,000 years to say SCPs that should get made. And my opinion really doesn't matter here. What matters is someone eventually making this. And there's 6,000 SCPs, and it's genuinely said that you should read them in order, just so you don't get confused later down the line, because there's a lot of lore stuff that ends up becoming part of it. And I already tried for 2 videos to explain all the groups even I just know of, but there's so much of it to like decode and understand that even me, someone who just started listening to it in massive amounts, I don't even think I have the right to make it. I feel like someone who's been there since the beginning could make this, but in the way of actually adapting it. If you did the Twilight Zone type thing, you could follow certain characters as they go through the story, and they would reoccur in these individual stories. You could even make up some D-Class and some task force people. You could do it with the boots in the ground. You could do it with the O5 Council overseeing. You could just use these sort of band of reoccurring characters to tell those stories. Or you could go and try to do it more traditional, which is idea 2. You go in and you pick or you make up individual characters in each group. And every week you just follow a different SCP, like a Monster of the Week type thing, but you keep the same crew. You kind of jump between the O5 Council, who are very interesting, and there's so many of them. I think there's 13 a lot of the times. You could follow a lot of these really weird people that are kind of part SCP themselves, or you could go in and follow people on the smaller side. I've always been fascinated with the D-Class, because the idea is that SCP get criminals and then they test on them, and they're called D-Class. And I've always thought that there aren't enough criminals for how many things they're doing. And sometimes I think that D-Class are just people who get in the way that get kidnapped and captured and brought into this whole thing. Or agents that have turned against them. And the D-Class could be a really good in for how to follow a lot of these stories, because they're the ones that get the most affected. But there's so many other groups too. And they're all interacting with one another. And that's the beautiful thing about SCP. It's such a big world. It's almost impossible to adapt. And I think the only way to adapt it in like a cinematic form, like a movie, would be the way the short film people are doing it. I don't think a feature hour-and-a-half long movie could work in the SCP universe. You could just do one SCP and stretch it that long, but it wouldn't work, because the whole point of SCPs is that they're quick, digestible, and that they flow together perfectly. Like, you can just go from one to another, and they might not even be related in any way, but it's still the same world. You could even establish this as its own sort of universe, separate from the regular SCP universe, the cinematic version of SCP, because SCP exists in a massive multiverse that is constantly explored throughout the series, and it's fascinating, and I love it, and there isn't really much more to do with that. And I really thought this was going to take a lot longer to explain, but it's actually very simple. You just pick a couple SCPs and you throw them in. You pick a couple of characters, you throw them in, and it's like the gumbo of entertainment. The fact that I'm only 15 minutes into this recording and I've already figured everything out shows how easy it would be to adapt this stuff. If I were to make my own, what would that be? Because there really isn't much else to say about this adaptation. Personally, just with my own personal taste, what I've already seen, I've only been reading and understanding this stuff for a couple months. Not even really a month, just like 1 month I've been really diving in. I mean, I heard about it before, but I never really understood it until now. And I still don't really understand it. But how could you actually personally do it? Well, just sitting here right now, I guess to pad out this episode, to really go and just go in full depth on this, I should just try to adapt it myself, just for fun. So what would a typical episode of this, like, Twilight Zone / drama show be? I feel like you have to pick a single character to really try this. I'm going to just pick one at random. Dr. Bright. Dr. Bright is probably the one I know the most about on the council. He worked for the SCP Foundation, and he found an ancient necklace with a jewel in it, and the necklace was created by a lich hundreds of years ago. The lich did everything he needed to do to become immortal, to have a phylactery that was the necklace. If you don't know what a phylactery is, it's like a Horcrux from Harry Potter. It's an object that you put your soul in so you can never die, as long as it isn't destroyed. You could start off this episode with the lich doing all these various magics and sacrificial stuff in a dark, ancient room, in a cave, in some medieval time. And he almost completes the ritual, and he takes a knife, and he stabs himself in the chest, knowing that he'll live forever. And then he falls down dead holding the necklace, and the necklace activates. He was wrong. He had to sacrifice someone else to make the necklace work. Hundreds of years later, an SCP agent walks up, investigating mysterious circumstances. He walked in the room, saw a necklace with a big jewel on it. I always imagine it to be red. He picked it up after putting his flashlight on it, put it on, and suddenly his soul was now trapped in the necklace. He took it off, someone else put it on, and suddenly he's in that body. He is now them. They have been deleted, and he has now replaced them. And he now knows his old body's gone, and he is now immortal. They capture him, they investigate him, they do scientific experiments, and they realize that he is 100% immortal. Eventually he gets let out. He works for the SCP Foundation, going through the ranks, and he becomes an SCP leader. He becomes one of the O5 Council. At this point, we have a newbie in the council that we can follow and understand in sort of this drama show. And we can see all the different ones. One of them gets turned into a dog at one point. One of them's a witch who's like half fairy. She's like an elf. And there's a bunch of them, and they're all working for the Overseer, who you never see the face of, just for the show to be more mysterious about this guy. Meanwhile, on a lower level, you could follow someone in one of the task forces, a soldier on the ground, boots on the ground man. They're not necessarily all that defined in the SCP lore, so this is where you could write your own character. A grizzled soldier on the battlefield of insane craziness. You could start with a rookie and maybe have an entire team. They all have these very fun nicknames. You could follow this team as they go on missions. Cut back to Bright and all the other overseers and get to know each of their individual stories. Every once in a while, you could cut to D-Class. Prisoners locked in solitary who are trapped and forced to do various experiments, and you can get a lot of the more horrific stuff following them. You don't even necessarily have to keep one as a character because they die so frequently. Instead, an episode can just start with you learning the story of this D-Class, how he got here, his life before SCP, the crime he committed, and then how he was thrown in. Or even sometimes following someone who was just accidentally thrown in because they knew something, and maybe they're immune to amnestics. You could follow all these different stories, and every week be at a different site, have a different monster, have a different story. You could even begin it with a voiceover at the beginning, reading the various report. Or you could go in as the report just says and just have it be a story. It's really up to personal taste. I would follow it more as a narrative than an actual report, but that's just me. It could really work if you started with the report, though. You could have a character that's secretly listening to all of these reports. And maybe every season change the person listening to someone else. And at the end of the season, they get caught and you see what happens when someone reads the SCP reports and they're not authorized. There's so many good ones to play with. I think it would be best to not go completely in order because some of the early ones are kind of rough. You could just say Series 1, Series 2, Series 3, Series 4, Series 5, Series 6. But the problem with that is that there's 6,000 SCPs. So you would never make it to the crazy stuff near the end. You'd never make it down the list to more crazy things. You'd never make it to SCP-2000 or any of those, any of the, farther down, 2000 to 3000, or you could never make it to 6,999. You'd never make it that far. I haven't even read the SCPs I just said. You couldn't even make it to Bigfoot. Like, Bigfoot is 1,000. You couldn't even make it there. So I think you would pick SCPs in whatever order you wish. There's no real canon timeline, and in fact, there is an entire SCP about how the timeline couldn't work, where a scientist is forced to try to make a timeline alone, and the more they make the timeline, time starts changing around them until it is boring and there's nothing there to tell. Because the universe is based around the magic of the chaos of it. The fact that nothing really lines up and things contradict. You can completely ignore entire parts of the canon, which is why it would be really hard to make this a real show. Because how do you create SCP without investing in it yourself and changing it to your will? You have to be very particular and leave it open to interpretation a lot of the time. People have very different views on all the different groups of this universe and all the various events that have happened. You'd have to start in the middle of it, and like I said, pick a random O5 and make up a random team and follow random D class. It'd be the only way to do it without sacrificing the original vision and theme of SCP. But a TV show does need people for you to invest in. You can't just watch random shit every time. It works for Twilight Zone and Black Mirror because there's so few episodes and they come out in seasons and you're expecting it to be weird and different every time. But eventually that dies out and people just stop watching because there's nothing to grab onto. It's just random nonsense. That nonsense is good, but there's no heart. There's no feeling. I think if you did SCP, you could still have those kinds of stories, but then you could introduce in it a character that we've seen before at some point. And if you have a big enough cast, then there's no problem there. You could still do bottle episodes and separate episodes where the main characters aren't present, as long as they exist in the world at some point. Because the fun of SCP, at least for me personally, is not just the random stories and the crazy twists. It's eventually hearing about other members of the groups. It's not so much about individuals as much as it is about the entire group and the people in charge of that group and the people within that group. But the truth is all that really matters is following the Foundation and then understanding the other groups against the Foundation and then also sometimes following the other groups. I wouldn't break this in seasons or anything. I would just keep going. You could use more reality-breaking stuff near the end of a season and then just restart like nothing happened. Or find a really good, really long story that can be broken into 2 parts and use that. I think if you were going to do the first episode, you would definitely do SCP-173, the original SCP, the statue. I think it's a great one to start with because it really gives you the vibe of SCP. Personally, I would follow a guard who is watching it, a guy on one of his first days training. And this has been done before. There are short films about this SCP. It's probably the most adapted SCP. But if you can get that one right, then you can move on to the crazier stuff. You could do the SCP where it's just an apple talking about how it's been across the entire universe. You can do an SCP about a yearbook that is seemingly weird about 1976 and a bunch of other really related stories that when put together give a bigger picture of a different new group that might be a threat to everybody. But I don't want to just list SCPs all episode. I will say I really want the board game episode. If I could only make one episode of an SCP TV show, I would love to do the board game just because I know it would be really fun to watch that. There's an SCP where Wondertainment gives the SCP Foundation a board game about themselves. And it physically sends you into this board game. And it has all these crazy rules, and there's like dozens of like different cards and effects. And it's basically just a bunch of references to other SCPs. And I think that would be a really fun episode to watch later in the series because you've introduced all these groups. But there's so much to play with in this show. There's ancient gods, there's cults, there's armies, there's cosmic horrors. And I think they're all very good. And I think there's a lot of 001s that could fuck with the entire show. And I think it would be fun to play with that. I think if you picked 001s that change everything and you did those as finales and they were always different and they didn't make sense with each other, I think that would be really interesting on a show. If you establish that 001s may or may not be true, if you had a framing device for 001s where one of our main characters is reading it and not sure whether or not it's true, then that works. But I think SCP would be an amazing series to watch. Just because of how weird every episode would be, but also how grounded it can be at times. Like, yeah, there's apocalyptic events where the entire world gets fixed, but then they just have SCP-2000, where they just say, oh, there's a factory, it just recreates all life on Earth and restarts everything. It makes sense, it's weird, but it happens. And it's really fascinating to see that happen. You could even start a second season with that. You just got to find a list of the best SCPs and you just have to go with it. You have to figure out how they flow from one to another and how it would all work out. And it would take a very long time to do. But you could create this perfect net of information, this weird mishmash of stories that somehow all fit together. These characters that are weird and cosmic and people who die constantly, but jumping around between these different things. The fun thing about Bright is that they can just keep coming back because they can't die. So even if they die at the end of a story, they're back. So they would be a really good lead to sort of keep track of everything. And the task force are the people that are dying every once in a while. The Game of Thrones type shit. You're following this guy you really like, and then suddenly, oh shit, he's killed by a giant spider or some crazy shit. You can follow the people that smoke the cigarettes that allow them to go back in time in loops. But then eventually they do end up dying. Starting off episodes with little teasers of D-Class dying. Doing episodes about containment breaches. Episodes about discovering SCPs. Episodes about other groups attacking the Foundation. Episodes where they're infiltrating groups. Stuff where you only follow a single character who's being affected by an SCP in the wild. It's endless. There's so much you could do with it. And as long as you jump around and you return to various characters at times, then it all works out. If you know that the cast you've been following, the O5 people and the various task forces, it would work. You could jump between them, and as long as they keep coming back and then they are replaced with new ones when they die, you still stay in. It's a hard juggling act to play, but I think it could work and make it more than just a Twilight Zone. And it still would be a Twilight Zone. It would be crazy, things would change, but it could still work. I'm fascinated by these short films because what they do is they just pick one SCP and they just play with it. They just do a tale of it. I think the best one I've seen so far is Overlord because of how mysterious it is, but also cinematic. There's so many visuals that are so appealing about that. People floating in the sky, monsters that only show up on camera. Really good shit. I would love someone to make a story about the Yule Man, but it's so horrific and fucked up, I don't know if I could even watch it. The story of the Yule Man is the Santa Claus SCP, and the idea is that this is an immortal serial killer that kidnaps children and forces them to make toys out of other children. And if they fail, if they die on the assembly line, they are used to make the toys. And this evil Santa will only give toys to those he thinks are good, and will capture those who are naughty and torture them in front of their parents. Torture their parents in front of them. And I don't know how you could do this unless it was an investigation trying to catch him, because that's how the original story goes. So if I did a short film about it, I think I would make it around the task force breaking into his factory. It never happened in the story because the only thing we hear about the Yule Man is one of his victims survives and we hear her story. But I think it would be really fucking interesting to do it as a tale and actually have them try to save these kids. And you know, the Yule Man would get away. They would kill him, but then suddenly he'd be doing the same thing somewhere else. But I think it would be a really fucking good horror movie to follow that. You'd make up a detective or an SCP task force member, an investigator for SCP, and it'd start with them finding the girl and maybe have someone read off all of the different moments that they have and then slowly say that all other agents have quit this. They've all taken amnestics to forget this case and no one's going to try to solve this one. And then have one agent be like, no, I'm doing this. And them slowly trying to unravel the case and then entire task forces breaking into buildings trying to catch him. Then they find the girl, or they start with the girl, either way, and you get the reactions of people looking at her as she's like blurry in a mirror. Like, you don't want to see her true face because it's so fucking horrifying. So you keep it off screen to make people imagine how bad it is and just describe what is happening there, just like how the story goes. I think the Yule Man would be amazing to watch. It'd be horrifying, and it would be bittersweet at the end because yes, they save the kids, but the kids are so fucking damaged and traumatized. No amount of amnestics is going to cover that shit up. And the fact that he gets away would make it so bittersweet because the whole story of the Yule Man is that he's still out there. And if you even go into his fucked up North Pole Santa factory, it would still be good if he got away and he just made another one. So that's how I would adapt like a horror SCP. But SCP has so much going on. There's so many different kinds of stories. Right now, the next one I can think of is The House of the Worm, which is fascinating. And you would just follow this man in the 40s, be a period piece. There's a lot of those at SCP. And him slowly building this factory, and it would sort of start with the raid on the building and the entire cult being transported to another reality that's only grayness. Them slowly losing their minds, following their cult grow as they want to infight and kill the man in charge. Them kidnapping his son and him being forced to go through this insane labyrinth of machinery that he himself created in an insane daze that he doesn't even know if this is what he made or if someone else kept working after he left. Slowly going through this insane maze until he finds his son in the end. And the end being so unbelievably tragic that I don't want to spoil it. But that would be a great movie too. That'd be a great 30-minute thing. These are so simple of stories. They're so perfectly designed that you don't even need to explain the beats. You just explain when it starts and where it ends, and that's all you need to do. Everything else is there to play with. The story's already fully written. You don't even have to break it into acts because it's so simple that breaking it into acts is almost secondary. That's why this episode's been so short so far. I've had to tell multiple stories because there's no way I could really go in depth without being boring. You could follow a Parawatch story. Those are always great, especially for a short film thing. Those are a little bit more creepypasta than SCP, but you could follow a bunch of people on the internet sharing recordings about something that happened. You could do a found footage movie about that very events that happened in whatever SCP this is. You could follow the account of one of the Lord Blackwood stories, a historically written diary of an elf hunter in the 1800s who did insane shit and fought insane things. And you could do any one of his stories and it would be fascinating. You could do a story about the Red Pool where there's a base in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic where they find this hole of red goo and various creatures coming out of it. Or the site that's very similar where they have this portal and they don't know how to stop it. It just keeps getting attacked and they keep getting attacked by these waves of horrifying creatures. There's so many stories you could tell in just that. The insane exploration log that keeps cutting out, getting more and more weird. There's so many good stories just about that one place. You could even make this show just about individual places. You could just make 3 episodes about a specific site, and there's enough there to do that. Speaking of adapting, I've never even thought about video games. There's so many SCP video games. I think there's more than there are short films a lot of the time. I've actually thought of a lot of ways you could make SCP video games. I don't even know if I want to give it away, but there's so many different adaptions of the stories. So many different ways to understand this universe. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, and I'm going to keep repeating it because it flows so well together. And if you get anything from this podcast, just go and read some. If you don't want to read, go listen to a podcast that talks about all the SCP stories. They're always really good. They're usually really heavily voice acted, or they're really well thought out, and you get really good opinions about the stories. It's really up to your personal taste. Personally, I always listen to the Exploring Series' podcast on it, because he just does YouTube videos about it and then puts it out on podcasts, but they're really well organized and explained, and he goes in depth about not only what just happened, summarizing it, but also how he feels about it and how a lot of the SCP community feels about it. So you get a lot more depth in that. A lot of that stuff would be lost in a show, but what would be gained would be a really thrilling escape that is a little bit more in depth than the actual writing would be. Some of the writing is so short that you don't get a lot of the deeper stuff, and that's what tales are for. But the idea of just having even more tales that are fully visual would just bring people in further into this universe. There's so many little things to play with and different groups to bring in. But I've talked about this last story a couple of times because I think it may be my favorite at this point. And it's Here Lies Dragons, or Here There Be Dragons. Some people call it different things. It's really simple, and it would be a very simple episode of a show. It would be one where you could have the characters communicate with each other while this is going on in the background. Because I think this would work better as a short film than an episode of a TV show. Because it's really simple. SCP finds a box. The box says, Here There Be Dragons on it. And they put the box in an isolated container, and every once in a while it'll open and let out little paper dragons that are trying to leave messages for them. And throughout the point of the story of them coming and leaving and coming and leaving, eventually the box is destroyed by a war within this realm in this box. Because the SCP Foundation cannot connect to it and explain anything, and they don't know what to do to help. And it's very tragic and it's very sad, and it works as a story that's written. But if you put that into an adaptation, I don't know if it could work. Some SCP stories might not be adapted. Some are right where they are. They're right where they need to be. But the beautiful thing about SCP is that there's so many stories that you really have to sit down with a team of people, look through all of these stories, sort of summarize, and figure out what can be adapted and what should be adapted, and then what will be adapted. You can't just adapt every SCP in order. That's never going to work because so many of them are so based in the writing style. So many of them wouldn't be interesting to watch. Some SCPs would work better as video games. Some would work better as movies. Some short films. Some would be part of a TV show. The only real way to do that would be to go through every single SCP, read every single one multiple times, and really go in depth and figure out which ones can be adapted and which can't. You'd need a whole team to do this. But once you did it, it would be such a good series of things. I would really want a big company to figure this out because they would have the resources to do this, but I'd be worried that they would ruin it and they would copyright it and it would be ruined completely from the internet. So adapting it is very risky, and I think the best we can get so far is video games based on interesting premises of it and short films, which is what we have right now. But it's fun to just sit down and imagine what that show would be. Maybe one day it'll happen, but it would be risky. And as we've seen so far, there's no way Hollywood would be able to make this. They couldn't even get Slender Man right. The Five Nights at Freddy's movie has been rewritten 17 fucking times. So touching something as beautiful and as sacred as SCP would be incredibly dangerous. So I'm glad that right now it's only in the hands of short films. If this was a perfect world, you could hire so many SCP filmmakers. You could make an SCP film festival where every movie has to be an SCP. But if you tried to make a Twilight Zone-esque show, you could do that. The thing that would be worried about it is that if it would be bogged down by that process. The stories already exist and you can just go read them now. And as long as those stories never get destroyed or taken away by this process of adapting, as long as the new people coming in don't expect something different, it's possible. And it's almost probable that at some point, someone is going to try to make this real. Someone's going to try to make this mainstream. And ultimately, it might damage it a little, but more people would hear these stories. So it's a big debate whether or not anything should be adapted. There's a lot of adaptations that just like completely destroy everything. But I just thought I'd sit down and try to figure it out. So in summary of all this craziness, doing it as short films is fine. I think they should do that. Somebody should make a festival. The video games are great, and it's a good gimmick to get people interested, but it's still got to be about it at the core. And a narrative TV show could work, but it would be best as a Twilight Zone-esque thing. But you could merge the two into something more interesting. And it would be really fun just to write all these as stories, but they're already written. So, yet again, go read SCP if you're listening to this. It's the best shit on the internet. And as always, thanks for listening. Bye.